The German name Nachrichtendienst broadly corresponds to what is understood in the English-speaking world as the intelligence service, while the term Abwehr, literally defense, was originally applied specifically to that section of the Nachrichtendienst tasked with combating the activities of foreign intelligence services. In other words, the term referred to the German counterintelligence service, when the 100,000-man army permitted to Germany by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was formed on 21 January 1921. An Abwehr section was organized in the German Ministry of Defense in Berlin. Colonel Jem P., who had served in German intelligence during World War I under Colonel Nicolai, was given the leadership of the Abwehr section. The division was small, consisting of 2 or 3 officers of the General Staff, with about half a dozen officers and a small staff of clerical staff attached. It was divided into 2 subdivisions, East and West, but initially lacked the technical facilities to deal with such matters as radio communication, production of passports, personal documents, etc., which are essential for the efficient operation of such a service, for work away from headquarters in the field. The Abwehr had offices which were organized in each of the 7 military districts and initially consisted of an officer of the General Staff, 1 officer assistant, and appropriate clerical staff. The Abwehr gradually expanded to include both counterintelligence and intelligence activities, both inside and outside Germany, but by that time the term Abwehr remained as a well-established term. Individual Abwehr operations were described countless times in the press. The descriptions were based partly on information provided by those involved in the operations, but this information was often supplemented and embellished with fictional dialogue and other details to such an extent that it becomes difficult to know where truth ends and fiction begins. At the same time, a common response to those who insisted that a true history of the Abwehr should be written was to claim that the Abwehr archives had been removed by the Americans to Washington and were therefore inaccessible. But the importance of these documents should not be exaggerated, nor should the importance of the Canaris diaries, about which there have been so many publications in the recent past. Many of the most important operations of the Abwehr were not recorded in official documents. In the peripheral offices we burned, out of necessity, with a certain sense of satisfaction, everything that had been put down on paper, all the documents, and were quite glad to be rid of them. The contents of the captured archives are only the skeleton of history. The living spirit is preserved only in the recollections of the participants in the events, and with their death it becomes impossible to write a true history of the Abwehr. To record some of the accounts and recollections of personnel who served in the Abwehr is the thought that gave impetus to the writing of this book. I asked myself, of course, whether I could take the responsibility of publishing this book, and I consider myself entitled to answer myself in the affirmative to this question. First of all, as head of the Istanbul branch, and also of an intelligence unit called Military Organization, mid-1941-1944, I had gained practical experience in the Abwehr. I had personally known Admiral Canaris, who had been in charge of the Abwehr for many years, and had ample opportunity to observe both the workings of the Abwehr headquarters and its management. However, as a reserve officer, the author was a trained lawyer, had a doctorate, and was later a member of the Bundestag. Note: I was sufficiently detached from the activities of the Abwehr to have an objective point of view. Moreover, as an advocate of the headquarters of the High Command in Nuremberg and of Field Marshal Manstein in Hamburg, I was later confronted with the problems dealt with by the High Command and thus got to know from within the actions of the German military leaders, which was essential for a proper assessment of the place of the Abwehr in the whole German military organization. It was not possible, nor did I intend to write a complete history, to cover all phases of the war in all countries where the Abwehr was active. Such a work would have been too extensive and tedious for the average reader. Rather, I have endeavored to select the most important or characteristic episodes. The basis for everything described below is absolutely reliable information. It is with deep regret that I must report that I have not been able to do justice to the achievements of all my fellow officers. In most cases, I have omitted or changed the names of the men who kindly assisted me in the work on this book, primarily because of the very natural aversion of any intelligence officer to the sight of his name exposed to the world in the open press. Also, quite a number of Abwehr officers had undergone severe hardships in the post-war period and therefore preferred not to have their names mentioned. I have fully honoured the wishes of the former and my obligations towards the latter. But to all those who have given me invaluable assistance, I offer my sincere thanks. In 1939, on the eve of war, the Near and Middle East were not within the immediate sphere of interest of the German High Command, and it hardly occurred to anyone, even for a moment, that German soldiers would be ordered to operate in these regions. They were, however, of indirect interest by virtue of the pact made with Soviet Russia. Germany had been forced to make an agreement with the Russians concerning the partition of Poland and to accept the inclusion of Finland and the Baltic states in their sphere of influence. This fact must be recognized as regrettable, but it did not carry with it the threat of any military consequences which would have affected Germany directly. And from the point of view of German war industry and economy, these countries did not appear to be important, except for one country which gave rise to gloomy forebodings and fears, and that was Romania. War in the Balkans would make things very difficult, and if the Romanian oil fields were lost or came under Russian control, the supply of oil to Germany would depend entirely on Russia. It was known that the Russians were going to occupy and annex Bessarabia. In an attempt to divert them from this, the possibility of persuading them to direct their activity to the Middle East, or perhaps even further east, was considered. An invasion of Afghanistan and a threat to the northwestern frontier of India would have been a fine thing from the German point of view, since very large British forces which might otherwise have been diverted to the European theatre of war would have been tied up. The idea of Afghanistan, however, was quickly discarded, as I shall show in the next chapter. Next, attention was turned to the possibilities open to Russian units when they descended from the Caucasus Mountains to the plains. Here there were two possible courses of action. Russian units could either advance to the plains of Mesopotamia and attack the oil fields of Mosul, or they could strike southwards through Persia and seize the oil wells of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. But these projects were also found, on detailed examination, to be unviable. An offensive through Persia would require a much greater effort and would be required to occupy Bessarabia. And in exploring the possibility of an attack on Mesopotamia, the presence of the French army in Syria under General Weygand was evidently the most weighty factor. Any action taken by the Russians would no doubt have resulted in the immediate intervention of these French units, and it was doubtful whether the Russians, who did not consider themselves capable of military adventures of this kind, would not regard Weygand's army as a considerable menace to them. Very little was known of this above-mentioned army. Its strength was estimated at between 100 and 150,000 men, but information about its composition was as scanty as information about its armament. At the turn of 1939-1940, when the Russo-Finnish War almost led to hostilities between Russia and the Anglo-French allies, the High Command was very interested in the possible future role of Weygand's army. While it was widely believed that it would invade the Balkans, the possibility that it might be used to rush on Baku and seize the oil fields there could not be entirely dismissed. If the latter option had been adopted, the situation could have become very complicated, for at that time Baku was still the main source of oil for Russia, a very substantial part of which was destined for export to Germany, and the German High Command was dependent on these supplies for the conduct of the war. Information about the terrain lying between Weygand's army and Baku was also scarce. The French could obviously move freely within their mandated territory, which was mostly desert and extended eastwards as far as the Tigris. Beyond the Tigris they had the North Persian Road, built by the British after the First World War, but then they would have run into the mountains of the Karadagh. This point was crucial, and the conclusion as to whether there was any route through the Karadagh mountains, with a capacity sufficient for military transport, could not be drawn from any existing maps. During the First World War, during the winter of 1915-16, the Hubner-Richter expedition worked in the area. I was the last living member of this expedition, and thus the only Wehrmacht officer ever to serve in the field in northern Persia. Colonel Wardemont, head of the Operational Guidance Staff in the Wehrmacht High Command, urged Admiral Canaris to send me to conduct a military reconnaissance of Azerbaijan, with instructions to obtain at the same time as much detailed information as possible about the strength and preparedness of Weygand's army. I was appointed consul in Tabriz and left for my new duty station in March 1940. I very quickly established that a road across the Kara Dar capable of carrying mountain troops existed, and concluded that 2 motorized divisions, manned and equipped for mountain warfare, would be able to reach Baku and remain there for a time sufficient to destroy it. The Russians were not expected to offer serious resistance. The Russians were suffering from the consequences of the war with Finland and the Russian army, thanks to the purges of the 1930s in which the High Command had been nearly decapitated and from which it had never recovered, was still severely limited in its capabilities. This reconnaissance of northern Persia was, of course, not only to examine the available transport arteries between Baku and Tabriz, but also included a study of all possibilities for troop movements in the area. It became apparent that no one, not Britain or anyone else, had paid any attention to the subject. There were a few large-scale maps, but for the most part I had to base my travels on the International World Map, a 1 million scale atlas, on which vast areas never before explored were represented by numerous voids, and what did appear on the map was largely misrepresented. The road from the Turkish border through Hoy and Tabriz to Tehran was part of the ancient Silk Road that ran from Central Asia to the Black Sea near Trebizond, one of the classic transport arteries of history. But a military reconnaissance of even this route was never carried out. To the southeast of Tabriz is the Shibal Pass, which was of some military importance. A little further south is the so-called Kaflanku Gorge, through which the road winds for many miles beside a rushing stream. Both of these places form obstacles of the utmost importance, but neither has been shown on the map. I also found that the ambitious plans of the old Shah Reza Pahlavi to build a road parallel to the frontier from Tabriz through Kurdistan southwards had failed at the initial preparatory stage. Such a road would have been of paramount military importance. Further, it could have been used to pacify the Kurdish tribes in these mountainous regions. But this project, as I found out on the spot, was very far from being realized. I heard that by order of the Shah, the Skoda Works had built a modern bridge near Sarkiz, south of Lake Urmia, and that there were 2 other new bridges 15 miles or further south. The road to Sarkiz was suitable for motorized movement, and as a consequence the area was accessible to motorized units. There was indeed a fine concrete bridge at Sarkiz, but it had never been used because people, as their ancestors had done for centuries, preferred it to the ford next door. I wanted to drive another 15 miles ahead to see the other 2 bridges, but met strong resistance to my plans from my interpreter and driver. During a stop for lunch at Meshid, they walked a little way, and in a prominent place they found 2 gallows on which hung 2 Kurds who had been executed for road robbery. At that time a car was a rarity in these parts and definitely presented a tidbit for attack. A single shot at the wheels would have been enough to stop the car, and the prospect of such a possibility led to the driver's adamant refusal to go any further. And he was not far from the truth. That very day the car was attacked on the Shibla Pass, 1 passenger killed and 2 others wounded. As one of the perpetrators later confessed, the target of this attack was the German consul. Germany's success in the French campaign removed any threat that might have come from Weygand's army. Weygand himself was recalled to France, and his army in Syria was included in the general arrangements for the cessation of hostilities. It is of some interest to ask whether this enterprise was unnecessary, or whether the Allies still seriously considered ever considering an offensive on Baku. During the French campaign, secret documents of the French General Staff fell into the hands of the Germans. It is clear from them that just as the Wehrmacht General Staff was voicing its concerns to Admiral Canaris in January 1940, French Prime Minister Daladier ordered General Gamelin, Chief of the General Staff, and Admiral Darlan, Chief of the Naval Staff, to study the possibility of an attack on Baku, and these two officers, in turn, were advising the British. This case characterizes the difference between the way of thinking of the Anglo-French allies and the Germans. The former decided to plan the operation as a combined operation Navy and Air Force, while the Germans considered solving the problem by using only land units. It is quite obvious that the possibility of using land units was not even considered by the Allies. Otherwise, some evidence of the preliminary reconnaissances they had to perform would have been made public. The necessary conditions for the combined operation by fleet and air forces, however, were the following. Firstly, the Dardanelles had to be opened, and secondly, the Turks had to give permission to fly over Turkish territory, which was tantamount to a renunciation of Turkey's neutrality. It is quite remarkable that a simple ground operation involving nothing more than a march through Iraq and Persia was not even to be considered, and that instead of it an expedition was risked to be planned which was to encounter political obstacles of the gravest possible kind. In the meantime, the results of the reconnaissance I had made were not altogether useless to the Abwehr. When German units reached the Caucasus and planted the flag over Elbrus in 1942, the Mosul oil fields and the large Anglo-Iranian installations on the Kar River seemed very close. It was decided that the Wehrmacht would launch an offensive in this direction. It was also assumed that the British would destroy the oil refineries and wells in the same way that they had destroyed other important sources of war supplies when they were forced to retreat. Since this refinery and wells were vital to the supply of oil to Europe, the Abwehr was tasked with devising a plan that would prevent such destruction. It was assumed that before retreating, the British would depressurize the wells and destroy the refinery. Such measures would, according to experts, put the oil fields of southern Iran out of operation for many years. New wells would have to be drilled near the old ones, and the refinery would have to be rebuilt from scratch. A plan was therefore devised, a technical innovation, the system d'ensablement, the sand plug technique, by which the refinery and wells would be temporarily rendered unusable while they were still in British hands. In other words, an attempt was made to sabotage an act of sabotage. The method, simply put, was to fill the wells, derricks, and pipelines with sand. Then a great deal of work would be required to depressurize the wells and destroy the equipment. This project was at first regarded in Berlin as science fiction, but the authors insisted and got the plan submitted for review and evaluation to a panel of experts who, after meticulous study, found it to be technically feasible. A detailed plan was then immediately initiated. It was decided that the operation should be carried out by a team of recognized experts, under the direction of a person who be familiar not only with oil refining techniques and the oil fields, but also with the country and the people, especially the sheikhs of the Arabian marsh tribes who provided most of the personnel for the oil fields. The development of the project proceeded smoothly, but it had to be cancelled when the German offensive in the Caucasus was halted and subsequent battles made it obvious that the Caucasus Mountains were the limit marker for any further attempts at penetration in that direction. Early in 1941, the Abwehr sent Major Scholl Seeholters to replace me as consul in Tabriz. When the British and Russians invaded Persia in August 1941, he and his wife, together with other Germans, were at first interned in Shimro near Tehran, but they escaped from there and after an adventurous journey found refuge with the Kashgai, one of the warlike tribes of southern Persia, to re-establish contact with Germany. Frau Schulz-Helthus travelled disguised through the Kurdish mountains to Turkey, a daring and difficult venture. The Security Service Reichsdienst, or SD. The Nazi Party's secret service sent 2 officers to Schulz-Helthus, and the small group held firm until the Kashgai, surrounded by the British, turned them in. Schulz-Helthus has described his experiences in an excellent book. There is nothing left to add here, except that his attitude and behaviour were in every respect exemplary and worthy of an Abwehr officer. Being far away and cut off from his leaders, he exhibited courage and imagination of a high order, making the best of his position. His efforts did not go unappreciated. By his actions, he tied up a certain number of British soldiers. The forces and materials which the enemy were compelled to put into action were considerable, and round one man arose a whole theatre of war in miniature. Although no further reconnaissance of the Near and Middle East was temporarily required for land force purposes, in January 1941, the Abwehr found new areas for its activities here. The impetus for this came not from within the Abwehr, but from the Foreign Office, initially at the insistence of the former representative in Baghdad, Grob, at the time Rashid Ali al-Gaylani, one of the leaders of the anti-British party, was Prime Minister of Iraq, and his main opponent was Nuri Pasha al-Said, who had helped Lawrence take Arab territories from the Turks during the First World War. Rashid Ali believed that the war in Europe gave him a great opportunity to rid Iraq of British influence, and in these intentions he was supported by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haji Amin el-Husseini, president of the Pan-Islamic Congress. He also counted on German help, and this help was promised to him. Each of the contracting parties, however, was soon disappointed by the other. The Germans had overestimated the combat effectiveness of the Iraqi soldiers under Rashid Ali, while Rashid Ali and the Mufti had greatly exaggerated the amount of help Germany was able to give. A few scattered aircraft were sent, but these were of no military value in themselves, and their cargo was too insignificant to be of any practical value for use by the Iraqis. The rebellion was quickly extinguished. It cost the lives of several German officers, and Rashid Ali and the Mufti fled to Tehran. Germany tried, through Dr. Rann, to get support for the rebels, or at least equipment and assistance for German supply lines from French soldiers in Syria. But at that time Franco-German relations had not yet reached the required degree of cordiality. Nevertheless, the uprising in Baghdad showed that this part of the world might be of interest to the German High Command, and Admiral Canaris decided to intensify intelligence activities either in Turkey or from bases in that country. A military organization, the name given to an intelligence center in a neutral, occupied country or in a country belonging to the Franco-British alliance, was established at the German embassy in Ankara, and an auxiliary office was set up in Istanbul, and Canaris himself, accompanied by Pickenbrock, his right-hand man, paid a visit to Turkey early in August 1941. The leadership of the military organization was initially entrusted to Major, later Lieutenant Colonel, Maya Zemat, who had previously been head of the military organization in the Netherlands, and I myself was appointed to head the auxiliary office in Istanbul, as Ankara was a purely governmental and administrative center and therefore very easy to control. It became obvious that much of the practical work should be carried out from Istanbul. I took up my duties in July 1941. Apart from the order to establish and set up a unit for reconnaissance in the Near and Middle East, I received no further instructions. 3 empty rooms were placed at my disposal, but I had no staff. To start with, I bought a desk, 3 chairs, a cupboard, and a typewriter. The latter was not of much use for some time, as I had unfortunately never learnt to type, but I hoped that I would soon find someone who could do it, and in any case some period of time must have elapsed before I had anything to report. My first employee was not proficient in shorthand and typed with one finger, but she had some other exceptional qualities. This was Paula Koch, who after the war was introduced by illustrated magazines to a curious public as the Mata Hari of World War II. The analogy is extremely wrong. Mata Hari was a frivolous young Parisian, while Paula Koch was a devout Catholic who, during the First World War, ran the most advanced dressing station in the army that advanced under General von Kress to the banks of the Suez Canal. She has earned an honourable place in the history of that war, one General Staff Officer said of her, and no work has been written on the course of the Suez Canal battles in which her name is not at least mentioned. She grew up in Aleppo. After the First World War, she founded a hospital in Pernambuco and another in the Dutch East Indies, and in the early days of the Second World War she devoted herself to caring for Germans interned in Syria. At her parents' home in Aleppo she became acquainted with all Germans of any importance and was on friendly terms with most of the noble Arab families. Through her good offices I established contacts with Arab emigrants in Istanbul, the most able of whom was Musa Husseini, the nephew and presumed heir of the Mufti of Jerusalem. He had studied in London and at Al-Azhar in Cairo, the largest Islamic institution of learning in the world, and the threads of his friendships stretched from one corner of the Arab world to the other. Around the same time, his uncle's friend and fellow conspirator Rashid Ali al-Gailani appeared in Istanbul. To have any dealings with him was somewhat uncomfortable for the ambassador, for the Turks had a strongly negative attitude towards Germans having any dealings with the Arabs. They preferred to keep all communications with these unruly subjects, as they were in the habit of calling the Arabs in their own hands. The ambassador was therefore happy to leave to me, as assistant military attaché and head of the Abwehr branch, the maintenance of liaison with Rashid. This connection opened doors to all Arab countries. When a little later the Prince of Egypt in exile, having made a bid for us, linked his fate with us, Egypt was also included in our intelligence network. Through contacts with Russian emigres living in Istanbul, it became possible to obtain a certain amount of information about Russia. The first and most active of the latter was a Menshevik who had been a member of the government of the Independent Republic of Georgia in Tiflis in 1919 and whose advice was invaluable. When the Russians and British occupied North and South Persia respectively in August 1941, the Germans were, of course, driven out of that country, but neither trade nor the number of pilgrims declined. And since the Shahs went on pilgrimage either to Kerbela, south of Baghdad, or to Mashhad Shahid on the eastern edge of northern Persia, every devout pilgrim had to proceed through the whole of the Russian and through part of the British occupation zone, and this he did quite voluntarily, especially if he received a small cash allowance. But it must be recognized that he only received money if he kept his eyes and ears open on the way. All these nationalistically minded men, of course, had to be thoroughly trained beforehand to fulfill the functions and duties required by military intelligence. Their own interests were purely political, and so Istanbul very quickly became the center of the political intelligence service. Many of our Turkish friends were also involved in the latter. Initially, the Turks were concerned to preserve the neutrality of their country. There was a long tradition of Turkish-German military cooperation, which had begun in the days of Frederick the Great. And so the Turks communicated more freely and openly with the Germans than with the rest of Europe. And they became even more sociable and outspoken if they felt that their information might be of some use in the context of showing Germany how to end the war by political agreement. The Turkish Foreign Service has an impressive history, and even today it is still evident that it once served an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Vienna. The reports of the Turkish missions to the various capitals of the Allied countries have always been most interesting. The British made the work of German intelligence easier by not always treating the Turks with the respect to which these proud people felt entitled. British policy towards Turkey during the 19th century was based on the principle of directly supporting and shielding Christian minorities from Islam. It was Gladstone who coined the expression unspeakable Turk and demanded his final expulsion from Europe. The Turk, however, being a proud man, reacts violently if he feels he is being labelled inferior to an Armenian Jew or Greek. One of my most useful sources of information was a Turk who worked in a British firm, the United Kingdom Commercial Corporation, but who was not promoted, favouring members of the minorities mentioned. The misconception that information can be easily bought with money is very widespread. In fact, this is very rare, at least in the East. Usually some other motive must be present, and hatred and revenge are among the most reliable allies of the intelligence service, just in connection with one story, which, it must be admitted, had nothing to do with intelligence. I wanted to ascertain the amount of a bribe paid by a local British intelligence residency officer to a certain lawyer, and I was anxious to cast my eye over the relevant document kept at the British Consulate General. Not 3 days later, it was on my desk, incidentally. The amount was considerably more than I could afford to pay in a similar situation. The document was safely back in its place, and it did not cost me a farthing to familiarize myself with it. The relative of one of the officers of the Consulate General had been murdered by an Englishman, and this was quite sufficient to secure the immediate fulfillment of any wish of mine to familiarize myself with the affairs at the British Consulate. At first I regarded my mission more as an extraction of political military than of mere military information. The most important question, I said to myself, would the Turks, being allies of the British, abandon their neutrality and enter the war against Germany? That they would do so of their own free will seemed highly improbable, but under pressure they might be compelled to do so. Such pressure could be brought from Syria and Iraq against southern Turkey. It was therefore vital to ascertain the strength of British and Free French army units in these countries, and this could easily be accomplished by systematic observation, the results of which could be substantially supplemented and reinforced by information from Cairo, the centre of Allied activity in the Middle East. Communication between Egypt and Turkey was not interrupted during the war. The Egyptian royal family was of Turkish origin. Mehmet Ali, the founder of Egypt's ruling dynasty, was born in Kavala. Up until World War I, the ruler of Egypt called himself Khedive, meaning representative, because he was the viceroy of the caliph based in Constantinople. When he assumed the title of king, the close social ties between Constantinople and Cairo continued to blossom, and many Egyptian families whose presence in Egypt was not welcomed by the British moved to Istanbul. Obtaining information from them and from their relatives and friends who remained in Egypt was easy. Direct reconnaissance of the area south of the Turkish border was carried out partly by simple visual observation. Finding out the number of soldiers, noticing troop movements, recording symbols and emblems on military equipment, we were, however, compelled to give our Arab assistants certain instructions designed to curb their Oriental fancy for numbers, and to teach them to reproduce the emblems and badges they saw in a recognizable form. This was a fairly simple task with regard to George on horseback or some other easily recognizable symbol, but it became a little more difficult when Australian and New Zealand units arrived wearing as emblems pictures of animals, such as kangaroos, which the Arabs had never seen in life. And a kangaroo drawn by an Arab observer looks even more impressive than in life. For this kind of briefing, I had to use the services of a professor of Oriental Studies who advised the General Staff together with the former head of the linguistics department of a Turkish college. Both of them had several assistants. These instructional cadres worked with the precision and integrity of a division of the General Staff and achieved excellent results. As movement across the Mediterranean was very limited, the British found that they had to send most reinforcements for Egypt and for the 9th and 10th Armies in Syria around the Cape of Good Hope. The assembly area for the British was Egypt itself. A substantial proportion of the newly arrived units and supplies, however, were concentrated in Syria and Palestine. The information gathered by my organization was reviewed and critically assessed by the Foreign Armies of the West Division, the appropriate intelligence unit of Army General Command, and then forwarded to African Corps headquarters. For about 2 years, the routine work of my section consisted of preparing a situational and troop movement map, reporting the arrival and possible use of motorized units and armoured units, the location of British Royal Air Force air bases and reinforcements being sent to them, and collecting general information of a military nature which was of direct relevance to the North African theatre of operations. We reported, for example, the sinking of the British battleship Barn 46 hours after the event. This fact was not recognized by the British and was not established by naval intelligence, nor was it observed by any of our soldiers in North Africa. The destruction of a large warship of this class had, and it is easily recognized, a vital influence on the character of naval operations in the Mediterranean. The loss of the Barn was not recognized by the British until 3 months later. Maintaining contact with Arab circles required considerable effort on our part. For a time, our activities in this interesting field of work centered around Rashid Ali, the Iraqi Prime Minister who had fled to Turkey, while the Mufti remained in Tehran. When the Germans and Italians were driven out of Persia, the latter joined the Italian ambassador under the guise of a servant. Thus, as a result of the protection afforded him, he had no choice but to go to Rome. When Rashid Ali heard of this, he was jealous and demanded for himself to be sent to Berlin. This was by no means an easy task. He had given his word of honor to the Turkish government, not to leave the country, but the latter, without relying entirely on his word of honor, watched him very closely. In this they had the support not only of the British, but there was a possibility that the Russians were also keeping a close watch on him. In any case, getting him out of the country was in itself a problem. It was not difficult to secure the necessary German passport for him, but it proved impossible to enter the necessary details of his arrival and temporary stay in Turkey into the documents. The results of the excavations carried out by the archaeological expedition were kept at the Consulate General. It was not very difficult to send one of the larger boxes to Bulgaria. The security officer who worked with me on this problem prepared one of them, and Rashid Ali expressed his willingness to travel in it. Even so, it was by no means an easy task. Then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came to our rescue. The Turkish government invited a delegation of German journalists to the country. It arrived in Istanbul in the foreign minister's private aeroplane and brought with it a large crate of sufficient size and strength to accommodate a grown man, although alternative means were also prepared. The Turkish government had been informed that the German delegation would consist of 8 members, and when the aeroplane arrived, 8 passports were naturally presented for inspection. The holder of the 8th passport, Mr. Reconnaissance, like the other members of the delegation, had received an invitation to a dinner to be held that same evening at the Turkish Press Club, to the sincere regret of the German delegation and their Turkish hosts. Here Reconnaissance was unable to attend because he fell ill unexpectedly and seriously, nor was he able to go to Ankara, where the delegation travelled the next day. The revelry lasted for several days. The evening before the delegation was scheduled to return to Germany, Rashid Ali arrived at the Consulate General. The most careful preparations had been required to so organize his movements between his rural residence at Erinköy on the shores of the Sea of Marmara and his city home that for 24 hours he could avoid close observation by the Turks, British and Russians. When he arrived, the German doctor was informed that Herr Reconnaissance needed medical attention. Rashid Ali was generously wrapped in bandages that would have looked great on a mumps patient. Fortunately, he was able to sleep well. But the next morning at dawn he was again carefully bandaged and arrived at the airport in a state of complete exhaustion that elicited sympathy and pity from all who saw him. The previous night's alcohol consumption had been so immoderate that very few of the Turks found the strength to get up early in the morning and come to say goodbye, and their only thought was to get home as soon as possible. After the war, I had occasion to ask a British intelligence officer, what did the British report to London about Rashid Ali's flight? The message received by London was that Rashid Ali had escaped by ship to Bulgaria, and later the initial report was confirmed by a reliable source. This was exactly the kind of legend that was deliberately spread by the Abwehr branch in Istanbul. The Turkish foreign minister complained bitterly to the German ambassador about Rashid Ali's behavior. With deep contempt, he exclaimed, "Ex colleague has broken his word," and this, no doubt, was pure truth. Other members of the Arab emigre community were received very differently by the Turks. Musa Husseini did not have to flee. On the contrary, he was told that he had violated public order and had to leave the country, and was given no alternative but to go to Germany. Before this happened, however, he had agreed to take part in one small venture with his friends in Syria, and he came to me and persuaded me to lend my support to a political coup in that country. I answered him with a refusal, because political activity was not within the competence of the Abwehr office in Istanbul at that time. But I agreed that the Berlin leadership would place certain funds at his disposal, provided that any material of value to military intelligence was forthcoming. Our argument centered round the cost of an enterprise of this kind, and at the end, after very careful calculations, we concluded that the outlay would be about 80,000 Turkish pounds, or, rounded off, 14,000 pounds sterling. This was one of the few occasions on which a written justification of the cost of the venture was requested from the Abwehr office in Istanbul by the Central Office. The reply came by telegraph, followed immediately by an initial transfer of 16,000 Turkish pounds. This was sufficient to start the venture. The mail aeroplane from Germany always arrived on Fridays close to evening and flew back early Saturday morning. Therefore, if written answers to questions posed to us were required, we always had to work very quickly. On one occasion, a package the size of a small cigar box was delivered. It looked as if it contained official instructions, and this was always the least desirable part of the correspondence. I told my secretary to lock the package in a safe, or, if there was no room in the safe, to put it on top of the safe. When it was unsealed the next morning, inside it was money in currency, 80,000 Turkish pounds. The original transfer of 16,000 pounds had been completely forgotten in Berlin, so that we now had sufficient funds for further action. The first priority now was to get the money to Syria. One of our Arab friends suggested that we try to make arrangements with the administration of Ibn Saud's court. We had previously had little or no contact with this desert king, and it seemed unlikely that he would want to have any dealings with us. But he might, on the other hand, have been willing to make a small favourable deal. We proposed that the Germans would make a payment to him at Istanbul, and that he in turn would make the corresponding payments in Syria. This idea, unfortunately, did not succeed, but the necessary arrangements were eventually still made by utilizing the channels of the wholesale grocery trade, which at that time was for the most part in the hands of the Syrians. The recipients in Syria belonged to the country's most senior families, whose names can still be found today among the ministers and other dignitaries in the Syrian Republic. But they must have been unacceptably careless, because some of them were arrested and the uprising ran out of steam. Money was found to support the families of the arrested heroes. But even after postponing the deadline for 3 months, there was no chance of success, and in the end I had to reluctantly abandon the whole project. A considerable amount of money was left on the hands of the agents in Istanbul, and I felt obliged to demand a refund from them. My German friends often told me that such a demand was absolutely futile, that I would never see a single farthing of my money, etc. To me, however, it seemed like a test. Do I place my trust in the right people or not? One evening, the leader of an Arab group came to meet me. From his waistcoat pocket, he took out a small bag wrapped in a napkin, and from other pockets he took out more and more, until at last there were 8 small bags on my table. In each of them were gold coins. I did not know how to thank my friend Abdallah. He admitted that it was not easy. His friends in the Arab youth movement had told him that these were the only funds at the disposal of the young participants, and they encouraged him to invent an excuse to keep the money. But to this he replied with a refusal. No, the doctor is always attentive to us. We must behave towards him in the same way. Gold was easy to acquire in the Istanbul free market, but one had to be very careful about the type of coins one purchased. There were old Napoleon doors, depicting Napoleon II with his imperial beard, but these French coins were not highly valued. The highest valued of all was the English sovereign, which in the market was called king because of the portrait of the king, but among the Arabs who were more interested in the horse under George on the reverse of the coin, it was known as horse. But even with British coins one had to be careful. The laws of Islam forbid the depiction of a human face, and in the case of gold coins, Muslims usually manage to overcome their religious precepts. But when a coin depicts a woman with her face uncovered, it is too much for the strictly religious sects of the hinterland. They flatly refuse to accept such indecent gold, which is why queens with a queen are always available at a slight discount. As the branch intensified its activities, finance began to play an increasingly important role. The operational management staff sent us a cashier who was unfortunately somewhat tone-deaf. In the hot Turkish climate, he had to work with an open window, and since, like most deaf people, he was inclined to talk loudly, the aliases of our agents and the amounts due to them echoed down the street in a loud voice. Later, we were able to replace him with someone with quieter speech. Sometimes, of course, we doubted whether this or that expenditure of money was justified. Once a relative of the Egyptian royal family told us that he was going to Cairo on business, connected with his wife's real estate, and that he might see politicians of some influence. I discussed with him in some detail the political situation in the Middle East in general, but felt that it might be a little indelicate to discuss the question of finance with him at this point. I therefore instructed one of my subordinates to look into the question of costs. Our friend's reply was that first of all he would have to meet the king, which meant that he would have to play Tarok with the king and lose to him. Next, he would have to frequent the Mehmet Ali Club, even though his mission did not require it, and this club was the most expensive establishment. The total expenditure would be about $10,000 and 5,000 Turkish pounds, in other words, between £4,000 and £5,000 sterling. It seemed to me that military information would have cost 5,000 Turkish pounds. But that an extra $10,000 was somewhat wasteful from a military point of view. I took the next train to Ankara and outlined the whole project to Mr. von Papen, asking him whether, from his point of view, the political aspect of the offer was worth $10,000. Papen replied that on such terms he was simply happy to cooperate with me, and thus the problem was very happily resolved. The results were included in 5 communications submitted for evaluation to Count Almasi, our acknowledged leading expert on Egyptian affairs. His comment was, "I wish I could sign these messages and pass them off as my own." One of the messages quoted a Turk from Egypt as saying, "I have seen a nation in tears once before," he said. "That was when the leader of the Turkish people died, and now I see the nation in sorrow again." The message went on to say, "I refer to the horror of the Egyptian people at the fundamental change that is taking place with the king. Until a year ago, Uruk-hai was a truly popular prince. Not only was he respected and loved, but he was also seen as a dignified and steadfast fighter for the cause of the Egyptian people. Since that time he has completely changed in both his personal habits and his entire way of life. He seems to have completely broken with all the traditions of Islam and his people. During the great fast of Ramadan, he was seen daily in bars and taverns. He came alone and did not wish to be greeted as a king. He appears in all the clubs with his mistress and often drinks too much. The queen expecting a child, and the queen mother take advantage of the freedom that the king's debauchery has given them. The luxurious pretentiousness of the royal court, with its 6 palaces in Cairo alone, and the emergence of more and more scandals are being discussed in the city, and are already leading to an undermining of royal authority that may prove irreparable. The other members of the royal family, almost without exception, are in quarrel with the king. He refuses to accept any advice, political or personal, and avoids on principle any frank conversation with the other members of the family. It is believed that, now that he has staked exclusively on the British, he has in his mind the prospect of the destruction of the Axis and the consequent strengthening of his position, allied to the temptation of obtaining the throne of the Caliph, which the British will give him. Some attribute the change in his behaviour to his youth, but the first instigator is believed to be Nahaz Pasha, to whose traditionally democratic and republican aspirations many of the recent changes can be attributed. A further decline in royal power and popularity, and with it indirectly the entire royal family, may one day lead to an attack by the Wafdi Liberal Nationalist Party in Egypt on the entire monarchical system of government and culminate in the creation of an Egyptian republic. Against such an attack, the heir to the throne will be defenceless, even if measures are taken to regain some measure of popularity. This message was written in the autumn of 1943, but not a decade later, Farouk's doom caught up with him. The same message expresses the following opinion. The leading political circles in Egypt firmly believe in the complete defeat of the Axis. They believe that Russia will emerge the real winner from this war, and that not only Germany but also France, Spain, Italy and the Balkans will fall into her hands. They consider it extremely unlikely that the Anglo-Americans will succeed in keeping the Russians out of the Balkans and Central Europe. In 1943, the receipt of messages of this nature was not welcome in Berlin. In principle, Abwehr offices were forbidden to take any part in political activities or to present any messages of a political nature. But in some ways, the unique nature of the links on which the activities of the Istanbul office were based made it inevitable that messages of a political nature would be received in increasing numbers. While this could be, and was, justified by the opportunities for acquiring sources of military information, the maintenance of liaison with Rashid Ali, which the ambassador entrusted to me, was really a purely political task. It was a pity to send a mass of political information to the rubbish bin, so I decided to deliver it all in the form of personal letters to the ambassador in Ankara and copies to the Abwehr in Berlin in order to keep Admiral Canaris fully informed of the political situation as it appeared to us in Istanbul. Such information was also coming in from the Balkans. The gradual shift of Allied support from Mihailovich to Tito was noticed in good time. Of very practical interest were the occasional reports of plans for a Balkan Union under Turkish leadership. In this, however, Turkey lacked the determination to act, for the Turkish army still had, since the Balkan War, a deep distrust of the Bulgarians. It seems a little strange today that this distrust was not dissipated by the fear of the possibility of the Russians seizing control of the entire Balkans, which they actually managed to do by the end of the war. Among the questions of a political nature, the biggest issue was, of course, in which direction did the possibility of starting peace negotiations look most promising? The American agent encouraged me to try to keep Germany from swearing and insulting everything I was told. If only a single friendly word was dropped, such a gesture would definitely lead to an exploration of the possibilities of making peace. In his Heroes' Memorial Day speech in February 1943, the ambassador followed this advice, and his speech immediately led to a debate on steps toward peace in the U.S. Senate. In March 1943, the Turkish Foreign Ministry informed the ambassador that the Archbishop of New York, Monsignor Spellman, was going to visit Turkey and expressed a desire to speak with the ambassador or his confidant. The ambassador suggested my candidature, but Ribbentrop intervened and forbade the meeting. In April 1944, I was informed by my Turkish friends of the third attempt as coming from the American naval attaché and former representative to Austria and Bulgaria, Earl. As I was no longer authorized to deal with such matters, the responsibility for this task on behalf of the ambassador was assumed by Mr. von Leuschner. Various other attempts of the same kind came to light. An attempt to establish contact on the part of the Russians, efforts on the part of the Japanese to organize negotiations with the Americans, and a long exchange of views between the Russians and the Japanese, who were not at war with each other until 1945. The Japanese were most concerned about the Germans starting negotiations with America separately from them. My old connections in America, where I had lived for nearly 10 years, were an eyesore to them, and at the request of the Japanese ambassador to Turkey, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, Oshima, complained about me to Hitler in March or April 1943. It is interesting to note that at the time no consequences were caused by this démarche. Hitler was evidently himself extremely keen to keep the door open for negotiations with America, but unfortunately he was unable to make proper use of the opportunities presented to him. In February 1944, an employee of my Abwehr office in Istanbul, together with his wife, fled to the British. While this is certainly regrettable, it could have happened in any intelligence service. But the wife of this officer was a distant relative of the ambassador, von Papen, and British propaganda inflated and exaggerated the importance of the incident to such an extent that it became a cause for celebration. Himmler, who had long wanted to get rid of Canaris, hyped the incident in Hitler's headquarters. Canaris was removed from his post, and I myself was recalled to Germany. In August 1944, relations between Germany and Turkey were severed, and the military organization, Near and Middle East, ended. Here is something from my work in the Abwehr. Many others probably have more interesting or exciting stories to tell. But before I get to those topics, I would like to describe what the Abwehr was, what functions it performed and how it was organized to perform those functions, and finally, how it was used by the Supreme Command of the armed forces to which it was subordinate.